there's this verse in Proverbs 29 that says, a righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. So I went on a little bit of a journey to try to figure out contextually what are the rights of the poor. What are they talking about? But if you get into it, it literally means the legal rights. Right? So a righteous man knows the legal rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. So using what you just said about a loss of society, what legal rights do the poor have that we're neglecting?
A right to be alive, a right to breathe, a right to have a place to go to the bathroom, a right to receive basic human needs.
And welcome to Miracles from the Hill podcast, where we share raw stories that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe. And of course, you can like, comment, and leave a review. To connect with us, visit our website linked in the description box. And now, here's our host, Ryan Dirk.
Welcome to the Miracles from the Hill podcast. I'm your host, Ryan. Thanks for being here. If you're new, man, we're so excited that you're joining us here today. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. All of you, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and buckle up. We got a great episode. We've got Lizzie Beber, Executive Director of United Ministries, here with us. Good morning, Lizzie.
Good morning, Ryan.
Okay, so I'm going to read my intro of Lizzie. So over the last decade, Lizzie and her family have had the privilege of living in an intentional community alongside a group of formerly homeless men at Christ House in Washington, D.C. She was born and raised in Clinton, Mississippi. She's an ordained Baptist minister. She holds a Master of Divinity degree from George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor, and was ordained by Calvary Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. The only thing I know about Waco is the shop, Magnolia Farms.
Yeah, that's right.
She's the proud mother to Eli, who's 10, and Annette, who's 7. And she just said in an email that she is still happily married to Eric on this journey of life.
Yep.
And today she's the executive director of United Ministries, located here in Greenville. And we'll let her tell us about the amazing work that United Ministry is doing in the Upstate. So we brought Lizzie on specifically to tell us her story of faith and how she was called to the ministry, to talk a lot about family homelessness. So those of you that are familiar with Miracle Hill, we don't do families. We do individuals in all of our facilities. And we so rely on the amazing work of United Ministries for a bunch of stuff that they do, but specifically we're going to talk about the family homelessness issue. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to share your story. And we're just going to jump right in.
That sounds good.
So the only place in Mississippi I've ever been was Meridian, Mississippi. I don't know what that is in relationship to Clinton. But tell us about growing up in Clinton, Mississippi.
Yeah, so Clinton is just west of Jackson off of I-20 on the way to Vicksburg, which a lot of people know because Vicksburg is on the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And the reason I grew up in Clinton was because my dad has taught at Mississippi College for most of my life. He's a communication professor, and we have a whole family lineage at Mississippi College, which is a historically Baptist school in the state of Mississippi.
All right.
So I grew up there, and my mom was a nurse, or is a nurse. She actually now also teaches at Mississippi College. So
nursing?
No, she's in healthcare administration, but similar. But they both have taught there and really served in that community. My dad is also has been a minister of music, kind of on the side, is what he always said. But really, in many, many ways, has given himself and really the family a spirit of giving and of serving as long as I can remember.
And so they're both still professors?
They are, yeah. So I think getting closer to retirement, but we haven't quite gotten there yet.
So he was a part-time minister of music. So you grew up going to church?
Absolutely. Every time the doors were open.
Okay, so tell us about that. What
And
was that
sometimes
like?
when the doors weren't open, so because we had a key. So, actually, my dad's father was also a minister, full-time preacher, pastor, and my grandmother supported that whole ministry as a pianist, and really in a very, a lot of us know those couples where both of them serve fully. But yeah, I grew up Southern Baptist and just a really rich heritage as a good Baptist, knew the books of the Bible in order at a very early age. Learning scripture was very important at an early age, and just really being deeply connected to the life of the church. I'd say that even more so at that time, Southern Baptist had so many missionaries all over the world. And so, especially international missionaries. And in fact, one of our family members was called to serve in Africa. And so that was a really big deal for our family to know that. So I say all that because that awareness of life outside of our little town came to me at a very early age and began to tell the story of God's love for the world. And so from as early as I can remember, I had a sense of that love. And of course, over, the years and as I got older, began to unpack what that meant.
So were you musical? Are you musical?
I am, although I don't do anything super well. I grew up singing and playing the piano. And I still sing. And I've actually just recently joined our church choir.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
So when did you meet Jesus? I mean, you grew up in church, but when did it become real for you?
Yeah, so definitely was encouraged to consider following Jesus and as a good Baptist, getting dunked is what we would say, getting baptized, full immersion. So I actually was aware of that. My parents did not pressure me, but I woke up one morning and had a dream, probably when I was about 8 years old, where I felt like God was calling me to love and follow Jesus. And I woke up and tried to make sense of it with my parents, and they just were really great about it. They were like, well, it sounds like you're ready to, do you think you want to share this with the church? And if you're serious about that, we will support you. And so I went and met with the pastor, and we went through different scriptures that just affirmed what I was feeling. And actually, my grandfather baptized me, which was very special. And I remembered taking that very seriously. So I was 9, which now I have a 10-year-old. So I think about, gosh, that's really young. But deep down, what I really always go back to is just that deep awareness of the distinct love of God through Jesus that I came to know.
Two things that stand out. Number one, this is the second or third time that I've recorded a podcast that someone's story included a dream or a vision. Isn't that, I think that's fascinating that that's the Lord uses that more times than maybe we recognize. The second thing that stands out is your parents didn't pressure you. I have young children, and I could go home right now and I could essentially manipulate my kid into saying the prayer. I could do it right this second. And my wife and I are both very convinced not to do that, right? To let it play out. And so even Sunday, my son's now coming to big church, and we had communion. And I was watching the pressure on him, like he felt left out because he wasn't in communion. And I don't want that to be a reason, right? I want that experience that you described, and for it not to be an external pressure that's making him make that decision. So you met Jesus at a young age. When do you believe that the Lord began calling you to ministry? You talked about missions in your family.
Yeah. I think it really was so much in front of me with grandparents and parents that were demonstrating a life of service in so many ways, although I wouldn't have known to call it that at that age. So it probably was in high school and then later in college. I did go to a faith-based school that I probably in college was where I began to really develop this concept of God's call by way of vocation. That was kind of a new way to think about it. And I remember hearing this quote by Frederick Buechner, who actually just recently died. So I've been thinking about him a lot, but he was a theologian. And he said, vocation is really where God's call and the needs of the world meet like the things that delight you the most. So this idea of really being called to something that gives us life, like that we've been created to respond to something or to use our life in a certain way, that it doesn't necessarily have to be heavy and hard and depressing, but actually like gives us joy and energy and life. It brings us to life. And so that really formed and shaped for me. And then I worked with a minister at a church one summer when I was in college who I just fell in love with the way that she ministered. Like she loved the people she cared for. She loved showing up to the work, and she really called it out in me and said, have you ever thought about ministry? Have you ever seen this in yourself? So that's really what helped lead me to begin to think about going to seminary.
So did you think when you're making that decision to go to seminary, did you think the pastorate was specifically where you were going, like to work in a quote church, end quote?
Yeah, absolutely not. I had never seen that modeled. And so it really wasn't until I went to seminary and then began to learn about various women who were in the pastorate, as well as just ways to express what I was coming to learn about myself. So I had just never seen myself in certain ways, like getting up to speak or having something to say, or even seeing myself really as a pastor. And so really doing some deeper inner work and reflection and study around what would it look like for me to be open if God was calling me to that. So I really leaned into that. And in many ways, fast forward now, while I'm not a pastor, so much of the work that I'm called to do in many ways is very pastoral. And that is how I choose to come, and really in my most authentic self, in the way that I'm trying to be faithful to the God that I follow, is expressed in that way.
So I think the work that you do and I do and we do here at Miracle Hill gets taken out of context a lot. So I very much view the work of Miracle Hill as domestic missions, right? So taking an Acts 1:8 perspective, it starts in Jerusalem and works its way out. And so that's what you're doing. You're a modern domestic missionary, which is certainly what the Lord is dear to his heart. So you finish seminary. Where's the Lord take you?
Yeah, so I stayed in Waco for a few years to work at Baylor. I had a really strong church community there that I was very, and it really was the first time I had experienced what in the church we call community, but really people outside of my family that I connected deeply with, that also I went to church with. So I began to experience God in new ways. And really what happened there was opening my eyes to some of the social justice issues, particularly in our country. And so I wound up moving to Los Angeles for 2 years, where I served in a short-term mission opportunity that provided hospitality to international families who had come to study at the University of Southern California. It took this Southern girl went to LA for 2 years and lived by myself, and I had a lot of growing up to do. And it was a really lonely experience. But actually, where that was so powerful was so many of these international families that had come to the U.S. were also lonely. And so there was an opportunity for connection. In that time period, I met my future husband, who was in D.C., and eventually moved to D.C. to be with him.
So if you're on opposite sides of the country, how do y'all meet?
Yeah, we met at our interview to do a service program, which is what took me to LA and took him to DC.
Really?
Yep.
So you started out super long distance.
We did, which was really hard and probably the best thing to start our relationship.
So why help those experiencing homelessness?
Well, I think for me, it absolutely needs to be a focus that acknowledges the state of life that people who are unhoused are experiencing. And these are the same human people that you and I are. Mm-hmm. So there's really not a lot of difference when we get down to our humanity. And that's honestly where I start. But acknowledging that those who are unhoused, that we call homeless, have a particular life circumstance that has led them there. And that's concerning to me. I remember when I worked at Christ House, which is where I was previous to being in Greenville, and we had a video, and one of the nurses who worked with us on the video talked about homelessness, and he used this line, and I remember hearing it for the first time, and it really stuck with me. He said, homelessness to me means a loss of society. He said, if we have allowed people to live in such a way that they are literally living on the sidewalk, then we have really lost our way as a society. And that was just, it was one of those moments where I knew that this was something that I needed to look more into and really think more. What is it that brings someone to that place? What happens? What's the story?
So my next question wasn't on the list of questions that I sent you. So there's all these great verses and passages in the Bible that talk about how caring for the poor and the needy are close to the Lord's heart. My favorite's out of Matthew, where Jesus says, whatever you've done unto the least of these, you've done to me. So I was on a run Monday, and it's what's today, Katie? It's Tuesday. I was on a run yesterday, and I was listening to or maybe it was last week, whatever the 29th was. I was listening to my daily proverb on the Bible app. And so there's this verse in Proverbs 29 that says, a righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. So, man, that verse struck me. I don't know that I've read that proverb 1,000 times, and I don't know that this ever jumped out to me like that. So I went on a little bit of a journey to try to figure out contextually what are the rights of the poor. What are they talking about? Because first my heart goes to the grace of God. But if you get into it, it literally means the legal rights, right? So a righteous man knows the legal rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. So using what you just said about a loss of society, what legal rights do the poor have that we're neglecting?
Oh, now, Ryan, you didn't give me that question in advance. I'm thinking on my feet. My first thought is a right to be alive, a right to breathe, a right to have a place to go to the bathroom, a right to receive basic human needs. How do you do that is a bigger question.
Yeah.
But just starting with, it's very helpful for me, especially when I get stuck in my feelings about what right and wrong. And I think about things a certain way because of the lens through which I see the world, which has been deeply affected by my socioeconomic status, my racial status, the family I grew up in, and so forth. But really going back to just the common humanity. So the humanity of the poor. So starting with that, like everyone, in my opinion, should have an opportunity to have their basic needs met. Where does that come from? That's a big question.
Even going more primal than that, everybody's made in the image of God.
Absolutely.
Right? Everybody has value. And so as I was reading on this verse, reading other people's thoughts on it, the idea that those with disregard those without is not a new idea, right? My first thought was to say, my mind's poisoned by my American experience, but that experience has been stable across time. You go back thousands of years when this was written, that was true then, right? That they were disregarded as not having value at all. So how did the Lord lead you to Christ House in DC?
So I mentioned that I fell in love with a guy who was in DC named Eric, and he was there. So I got a job.
Was he at Christ House?
He was not. He actually was serving at a church because he also comes from a ministry background. And I knew that I didn't want to also work at the same church or even try to pull that off. So I got a job at this place called Christ House as their volunteer coordinator. Christ House is a medical respite facility, which Miracle Hill has a medical respite model for beds. But this is a 34-bed medical respite facility for men experiencing homelessness who have acute medical needs. So really capturing folks who would otherwise be cycling through the ER. And as a part of that organization, which was started in the mid-'80s, which was at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and then particularly with male population, that was folks were dying. So that, compounded with being homeless and sick, they were seeing a lot of people die. And so actually this organization was started by a little faith community that was formed around call. And they were formed around... we can't, as people of faith, continue to see people dying on the street when we can do something more about that. And so they had imagination around what would around-the-clock, 24/7 medical respite model look like. Now, medical respite wasn't a model then.
Yeah, no, they're making this
They
up.
developed it.
Yeah.
And so they held what I look back on as really an imagination of what God could do and what God was leading them to do. They also, at the time, though, knew that in order to pull it off, that they felt that they needed to have staff that were living on site, and so developed a model where at any given time, about a fourth of the total staff live on site to both work there, but also build community among the men who are being cared for. And so I go in as, a 20-something, naive, well-intended minister to bring volunteers in. And I fell hard and fast for the mission because I had never seen anything like it before. And so fast forward 2 years, I stuck around. My husband, Eric, eventually came on staff. And then about 2 years later, the community asked us if we would consider moving on site, which felt like the next right step. And so we moved into a building that had evolved over time, but as men got better, the agency eventually developed permanent supportive housing options for men who had graduated from the acute facility but still had chronic illness needs to be cared for and supported. And so we moved into the community where 37 of those men live.
So let me just give a little context to our listeners. So, dear listener, imagine for yourself that you have been sick, you've been nauseous for months, and you finally find out that you have to have your gallbladder removed, which is a super simple surgery. And so you go into the hospital, you have your gallbladder removed, they put staples in your side, and you walk out the front door and you have nowhere to go. Right? That's a reality that people don't think about. And shelters typically are not set up for medical intervention, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly Miracle Hill's shelters haven't been for decades and decades. So the idea behind medical respite is that you have a shelter scenario where you also have medical care on site for people that have acute, often short-term issues that they'll get better from. And without that medical intervention, to Lizzie's point, they just repeat the revolving door on the emergency room. They get sicker and sicker and sicker. So living in the facility. So we have living members and members of staff in our facilities. So how do you believe that kind of live-in component? You and Eric move on site. How does that change the relationship as you're doing ministry with and in relationship with the people in the facility?
Yeah. Well, it changes. I think it can change in a couple different ways. I think you, as the one who is often seen as the giver. So we were the staff. We were the ones providing the care. But very quickly in moving there, those tables turned. And the men who lived there both gave us the incredible gift of relationship, which quite honestly, they didn't have to do. They opened themselves up to us. And I should just really be clear about the makeup of who was living there. So Eric and I are both white, both from the South. And we lived with 99% of the men who were in that building are African American, many of whom have been incarcerated, had been homeless, and had been sick. And so there were just a whole list of things that could have kept us from being in relationship with one another. So really their openness to us and helped us to begin to learn how to be in relationship beyond just being staff. And so walking out on a hall and seeing your neighbors and beginning to see each other that way, talking about things like, what did you buy at the grocery store? What are you cooking for dinner tonight? Oh gosh, like you were sick today. Is there something I can do for you? So that was one way. What really was a pivot for us was welcoming children into the world, in the way that those men loved our children. Our very flesh, the very thing that you're most proud of, you're most concerned about, you think about more than anything else in your life. I don't know about you, but I think about my children a lot, and I'm fiercely protective of them. And the way that those men saw our children as a part of their family was huge.
There's a guy that has been a volunteer with us for 20 years. And I first met him, he was serving meals at one of our facilities, and he was bringing I think she was 5, his 5-year-old daughter. And so he would say that people would always ask him, aren't you scared to have your daughter? And he said, if anybody made a move towards my daughter, there was 80 to 100 men there ready to defend her, right? Like it's the same idea that by sharing your life with someone, it equalizes things. And now you've got, in your case, 30-something, older brothers and uncles and fathers to protect your children. But it equalizes the relationship. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Super neat. So you, so eventually the Lord calls you to Greenville, to United Ministries. So how does that experience at Christ House inform the way you approach ministry at United Ministries?
Yeah. So while we were at Christ House, so we were there for 12 years. We lived on site for 10. And I tell people they were 10 of the most incredible and challenging, just inner challenge, as well as just helping us to understand how to reckon with our past, as well as our future. So looking at that time, during those years, we became introduced to someone named Brian Stevenson, who leads the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and in that book, he tells the story of several people that he has represented, specifically on death row. Some of them are Black, and he really goes into the experience of Black people in the United States. That story, while living at Christ House, really was a pivot for us. And specifically, when you hear Stevenson speak, so United Ministries hosted Stevenson earlier this year, and he always gives 4 things you can do right now after he gives his spiel about racial justice, for example. And the first thing that he always says is get proximate to the issues. And I remember the first time I heard that, and I thought, that's what we're experiencing. I've never thought about it that way. Like, what an honor to get to be in relationship and to get close. All to say, that led us to really beginning to think about what would it look like to move back to the South, which is where we're from. So I'm from Mississippi. Erica's from North Carolina, so we're not technically from Greenville. But we actually had friends who lived in Greenville and had visited. We were looking to move back to the South, really, instead of being folks who live up in D.C. and critique the South and all that's wrong with it, really coming to love the place that we're from. And wanting to be a part of justice work back where we're from. And so I learned about this opening at United Ministries. I really came to visit with an openness, but not knowing a whole lot. And when I got here and began to hear some of the stories of the community, a community that was in significant transition, that was getting on the map as like one of the best places to live in the country, and yet there is a growing population of people living in poverty.
Yep. And
particularly for United Ministries, which is located on the west side of town in an area that was quickly gentrifying, I got excited thinking about being a part of an agency that really wanted to impact the future and the changes, especially as it relates to people in poverty.
So who is United Ministries?
Yep. So United Ministries is a 52-year-old nonprofit here in Greenville, serving Greenville County. That's really a social services provider. So we provide services for folks who are in crisis, all the way, a bit of a continuum, to folks who are really looking at long-term, what we call thriving goals, such as moving from poverty to things like home ownership. So we serve individuals as well as families. The majority of the people we serve are families, particularly families who are experiencing homelessness or are vulnerable to homelessness, and walking with them on their journey to what we call self-sufficiency.
So let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So you have Place of Hope. What is Place of Hope?
Yep. So Place of Hope is a day shelter for chronically homeless adults experiencing homelessness, where we provide services Monday through Friday mornings, showers, laundry, bathrooms, clothing, as well as case management, both during that time and outside of that time. So we serve around 50 unique individuals a day.
And it's not just serving the individual. So Nick, who works there, Nick is developing relationship, right? Like he's building long-term relationship with those individuals. So I also know you have a GED program and kind of a job readiness program, because we send you a bunch of our people. So how do those two components, GED and job readiness, fit into this continuum?
Yep. So we are currently developing more of our language around what it is that we're doing. But we are looking at 90% of the people that come to us across the agency are living below the poverty line when they begin working with us. So that could be entering in through the GED program. It could be entering in through our homeless shelter for families. It could be coming in for rent and utility assistance. But 90% of them at any given time are living below the poverty line. So what does economic mobility, so working in an upward way to build wealth, to build basic needs, to be able to live independently. What does that need to look like for an individual or a family? So we see something like a GED as an entry point, because for a lot of folks, you can't get a job of a particular living wage if you don't have your GED. So it's one entry point in someone's journey towards economic mobility.
So let's try to clarify some terms. So for our listeners, what is the poverty line?
Yeah, so every state has a different number. In the state of South Carolina, for a family of 4, it is $28,000.
So let's talk about a living wage for just a second while we're on it. So $28,000 for a family of four, and there's a lot of people that would say, how do you make $28,000 work for a family of four? And I would probably say you don't. I would say the poverty line's maybe artificial. So we have this thing in the United States called the minimum wage, and the minimum wage is, what is it, $7.75 now? Something like that.
I do not know that off the top of my
So,
head.
not to get into the politics of a minimum wage, I'm not
Yep.
arguing for or against it. But if the minimum wage would have kept up with inflation for the past 4 decades, the minimum wage should be somewhere around $22 to $25 an hour.
Yep.
So put that in perspective, right? So if somebody is uneducated, has not had adequate access to economic mobility in their life, and they're making $7-8 an hour, they literally can't provide for themselves. And so what you guys are trying to do is give them a hand up to create opportunity in their own life.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, and I would just add, we know and actually have done some research through the Riley Institute in the last few years at Furman, that the relationship with the folks who come to us, that we have with them while they're working on these longer term goals, is key. To really believe that it's possible and to support them as they seek to access the resources.
Whatever the resource is.
Whatever they are, because everybody's story is a little bit different.
So we're going to stop this session, and we're going to do this in 2 parts. And so we're going to come back and jump back on and jump onto the subject of family homelessness. But let me pray for our listeners, and then we'll say sayonara for this episode. So, Lord, we love you. We thank you for today, for waking us up and giving us another opportunity to serve you. Lord, I thank you for Lizzie, for the work that United Ministries is doing, Lord. And I pray for each guest that's walking in the front door of Miracle Hill and United Ministries, and all the other people that are engaged in this space. These people are coming in, and they may not have hope or a vision for the future. So, Lord, I pray for them that they would feel peace as they walk through the front doors. They would find hope. Ultimately, Lord, I pray that they would learn who you are. We love you. We trust you. We thank you for the opportunity to learn and to share today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thanks, Lizzie.
Thank you. Great to be here.